the last episode, we talked about the seabed search, which, as we know, resulted in nothing. A lot of money, a lot of time was spent. It was October 2014, and the plane had been missing for 8 months. Everyone had hope in finding, hopefully, the black box or at least some pieces of something. And not only did they not find anything, it ultimately is what led them to give up. But people had not forgotten about the concept of floating debris. Let's talk about that a little bit.
When they started the seabed search, when they were scanning the bottom of the ocean, and they started that in October of 2014, about 8 months after the plane went missing, it was going to be like a 2-year-long process, and they wouldn't find anything. But that itself is not nothing. Right? That's actually really something, because they searched a huge area, ultimately the size of Great Britain. The fact that it wasn't there in Bayesian terms, as we're looking at this from Bayesian terms, that actually is a huge amount of information. It really cuts down from one hypothesis and puts the probability higher on other alternative hypotheses. So I don't want to minimize what they achieved. They spent a lot of time and money, and they really achieved something important. However, that's not what we're talking about today.
You're right.
As you say, we're going to talk about floating debris.
Okay, but no, you make a good point that finding nothing doesn't mean that it was specifically a failure. It just means that hypothesis didn't come to pass because it wasn't there. So, where do you go from there?
It proved yet again that assumptions can be wrong. And so the assumption that they had it all in hand was wrong. So to get back to our story, so it's been 8 months. It's now October. It's the southern summer is starting. The warm weather is starting. Good search weather. People are starting to ask. We're starting this new process of the seabed search. We're optimistic about that going forward. But in the meantime, what's going on with the debris? Because by now it's been 8 months. And if you think that the plane went more or less where the search area is, then in the intervening 8 months since the crash, there should have been a lot of debris, because we know that a plane hit the ocean. This should have made lots and lots of pieces. And those pieces should have, first of all, probably been seen from the air if they were looking in the right place. And then secondarily, those pieces eventually should have washed up somewhere.
Back in 2014, then Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbot, had a quote. He said,
"I am now required to say to you that it is highly unlikely at this stage that we will find any aircraft debris on the ocean surface. By this stage, 52 days into the search, most material would have become waterlogged and sunk."
Well, that doesn't make sense to me. Because well, I mean, some of this stuff is like kind of waterproof. I mean, I'm not a seat cushion manufacturer, but I don't think that those kind of things get waterlogged and sink, and nor do pieces of metal debris, right? I mean, this is not exactly how this works, and you know about this from the Air France flight, right?
Right. Yeah, we've got a great graphic of the stuff that they found floating when they did aerial searches for Air France 447, that case back in 2009 that we keep referring to. This also was a plane that went down in the middle of the ocean, in this case, the Atlantic. It was very far from land, but they were able to fly out and spot this stuff and collect it. So by analogy with that crash, there should have been a lot of pieces. And yeah, no, I mean, when people talk about, there's a lot of attention these days to, floating plastic debris and the Great Pacific garbage patch. I mean, the whole idea is that this stuff never sinks. It never goes away. So that seems a little contradictory, actually. But you're right. We keep getting these statements from Australian politicians that are, suit the message that they want to get across, which in this case is, we don't want to look anymore. Not that it's not there anymore, but we just don't want to look anymore.
I'm sure, pieces of luggage might sink to the bottom, or engines, stuff like that. But certainly there are enough plastic and metal pieces and rubber pieces that would float. I saw, so we got a quote here from Emirates Airline CEO Tim Clark. I thought this was interesting. And he was expressing frustration from the ATSB analysis of the plane. He said, "Our experience tells us that in water incidents where the aircraft has gone down, there is always something."
Right.
I mean,
yeah. I mean, when this happened back in October of 24, 2014, I was wondering about this, and I was starting to look at historical analogs and to try to understand, well, should we expect to find this or not? And in every single case, including some like previously back in history, there was a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, which is not an aircraft type I was familiar with.
No.
But it's like kind of an old school 4-engine prop plane from 1957, and it disappeared between San Francisco and Hawaii. And even there, this is, pre-satellite age, locator beacons and everything. They sound Navy ships and they found pieces. So there should be floating pieces.
And not only should there be floating pieces, but I think maybe a lot of people think that the remoteness of this flight is an impediment in finding that. But back in 1957, when that Stratocaster, the Clipper Romance of the Skies, which is an excellent name for a plane. So back in 1957, they literally used an aircraft carrier and they found the floating debris, and that was like 1,000 miles from the nearest land. And that was like 1957 technology.
Right.
Whereas this general seabed search for MH370 was like 1,500 miles southwest of Perth, Australia. So yeah, it's farther, but we're talking about 21st century technology. Yeah.
We've got like much more reliable aircraft and longer range and faster and all that. So, there's this real kind of growing sense of, wait a minute, why isn't there any floating debris? There should be, because at this point, literally all we have are these mathematical pings that no aircraft has really generated by themselves before. And we've got this mathematical method that these scientists have cooked up that like only a handful of people in the world seem to really understand how this works. The entire mystery is hanging on a very thin thread without any kind of data that supports it.
I'm looking at this map, which I'm going to put up on the screen, which is the search area, or the surface search area coverage up until April 28th, 2014. So you can see that there's a part to the south and a part to the north. They searched the southern part first because they were using that Inmarsat data. And then they realized that the BTO data implied that, they assumed that the BTO data implied what we all thought, which was the plane was flying straight and fast, and that's where it would be. But then they got the BFO data, right?
Right. So what happened was, when they first got the Inmarsat data, they could only really make sense of the BTO data. And they were like, okay, well, and we talked about this at length in previous episodes, but if you look at the ping ring data, it and if you assume that the plane was flying straight and fast, it tells you right away where it went. And so that's where they started to look. Boom, right away. And then they got the BFO data, which was really complicated and hard to understand. And they started to think, maybe we should try to look at paths that follow the ping, that lie on the ping arc, but also fit the BFO data. And if you do that, you wind up looking at courses that go much further north. And so they skipped from deep south to much further north, and they missed this whole intermediate part. And then they had more time to think about it. They finally really understood the BFO data in depth, and they realized that approach, which, by the way, is to help define the area where they did that acoustic pinger search we talked about.
Yeah.
They were like, forget it. That's wrong. All of that is wrong.
Do you think it would be a good idea to, since we're on episode 16, to just give our listeners and viewers like a super fast, like 140 character recap of what BFO data is, because it's so significant and maybe not everybody remembers this to the extent that we do.
So there's two kinds of Inmarsat data. The BTO data, which is the time that takes the signal to go between the satellite and the plane. And that time tells you how far the plane was from the satellite. And when you map all those out, it makes these series of arcs. And from the arcs, you can drive the path that the plane took. But the complication is it actually gives you two paths, one of which is kind of a symmetrical mirror of the other. One goes north, one goes south. And so the second part of the Inmarsat data is the BFO, or burst frequency offset data. And that has to do with the relative motion of the satellite and the plane. It's very complicated, but I think we explained it in the frequency episode.
For sure. And you should go back and refer to that.
For sure, definitely.
So next topic is is flotsam, which is a word that you hear like used in slang, but it really is a real word.
not to be confused with jetsam.
Which is also a real word. Yes, I looked them both
Yeah,
up
do you
to
know
make sure I knew the
between
difference.
flotsam and jetsam?
I do now. Flotsam is pieces of debris from, I think it was typically a ship, but it could also be a plane. And jetsam is like stuff that you would throw over on purpose
Right.
to lighten your load or to drop fuel or
Yeah.
something like that. Okay, so wait, no debris had been spotted at all. I mean, there was actually. I mean, people thought they found debris, but it was debunked. I mean, in the early days of this thing, they found oil slicks and they found blobs of things, but it turned out to not be plane stuff.
Throughout this mystery, there have always been claims, people making claims. I saw this thing. I found this thing. Somebody told me this thing. And one of the real challenges of MH370 has been separating the wheat from the chaff and trying to understand, like, what is a credible thing and what is not a credible thing. Some of these things that people said, oh, I found this piece of something. Well, guess what? It was. But you have to discriminate what's real and what's not. That's the challenge.
So at this point, logical people, I mean, all of us thought that some of the flotsam was going to wash up on a beach. I mean, that I don't know.
A lot of people were thinking this.
And there are a lot of beaches where it could have washed up, but the question is, where would it wash up?
We had this pretty well constrained, I would say, not small, but well constrained area where we thought that the plane went. And so at the time, various people who were interested in this, I was one of them, started to think, okay, well, where would it go if it fell somewhere in this general area? Where would it go? Where should we look? And at the time, I wrote a blog post about this, and I used a simple online tool where you can click on any part of the ocean, and it'll run this very simple model, and it'll show the particles.
Yeah.
Like spreading out. And I think we should maybe talk a little bit about floating and drift. It's called drift modeling.
I think we should. Let's talk about drift modeling and currents and things. I'm looking at this map of the predominant currents in the Indian Ocean, and it actually kind of makes sense to the layman that I am.
Yeah, so there are currents in the ocean, and these are sort of like broad tendencies of the way that water moves. The most famous current, at least as somebody on the east coast of the United States, is the Gulf Stream, which goes up from the Caribbean up towards Northern Europe, and it makes England and Scandinavia much warmer than it otherwise would be, because you've got this large scale movement of water. But I think it's important for people to understand that it's not nearly as deterministic as that picture makes it seem. A sort of way to think of it is imagine that you take a little handful of a pinch of pepper and put it in your bathtub, right? It'll land in the bathtub in a little patch, but then the pepper will kind of spread out kind of randomly in every direction. And that same thing will happen with, seat cushions from an airplane or rubber ducks that fell off a container ship. And so things do tend to move in a certain direction, but they also spread out while they're doing that.
So just because a drift model says one thing doesn't mean that stuff can't drift in different places? Or are you saying that it's more
It's not
swirly?
So deterministic, it's more probabilistic.
Okay.
So, and it kind of works backwards and forward in time in this sort of Bayesian way, where it's if you have a piece at location A, you can do a reverse, the further back in time you go, the bigger the uncertainty as to where it came from. And conversely, as you project forward into time, the more possible areas this rubber duck could wind up. And we have some video as well that video viewers can see various computer models where people, they take a million virtual particles and they run it through a sort of a model that is based oftentimes on a combination of actual drifter model. They have these devices that oceanographers throw in the ocean, and they sort of transmit their location by satellite. So you can actually see the actual current in action on this particular particle. And then if you do that thousands of times, which they do, you can kind of get a good idea of how probabilistically things move around. And things will go backwards and forwards and up and down. And it's very much a crazy walk, what they call a drunkard's walk in statistics. So as you can see, if you look at the video version of this podcast, you'll see that so there's this sort of general current trend in this part of the southern Indian Ocean that kind of goes counterclockwise.
Yes.
And so if you're in the bottom part of the search area, you're near 5 o'clock and you're going to be carried up towards 3,
Which happens to be Australia.
which is kind of, and you'll also be carried sort of to the east. So you'll be carried sort of to the north and to the east. You'll sort of spread out and diffuse in that way. And you'll wind up on the Australian coast. If you're a little bit further north, you're more at like 3 o'clock. You're going to be carried north and then also to the west. And so you're going to wind up towards Madagascar and the kind of South African coast, that sort of area.
And this totally makes sense if you just look at this video. And if you're not watching this podcast and you're listening to it, then you should definitely just visit deepdivemh370.com because we have the graphics there. October 1st, you interviewed a pioneering ocean current researcher named Curtis Ebensmeyer. This guy sounds very, very smart. He's a retired professor of oceanography at the University of Washington. You got to tell me about what he said to you.
Well, he had spent his career kind of trying to understand currents in the way that we've been talking about. And so when I came to him and I said, listen, it's been at this point 8 months, and should we have seen things by now? And he drew a hand-drawn chart that he sent to me, which we have.
Let's put that up right now also, because it's kind of cool.
So he basically is like, there should be pieces in Australia, kind of right now. That was based on a more southerly endpoint, which is more consistent, again, with that initial, like the plane probably flew straight and fast. So then that got me wondering, well, okay, is anybody in Australia looking on the beaches? And the answer was yes, a ton of people in Australia were looking on the beach.
Yeah, so because he could even tell you how quickly this wreckage would have traveled. He said that if it was in that area, it would have been going 5 to 10 miles per day. And those computer models of drift patterns suggest a similar conclusion. So sure enough, you got those beach guys, those beachcombers in Australia who were kind of on high alert.
They were on high alert. I mean, and not necessarily in an official way. I mean, you didn't need to like sound the fire horn and put out an APB. Everyone in the world was obsessed with MH370, throughout, I would say, 2014. And so every time a person in Australia went to the beach, especially in this, southwestern part of Australia near Perth, they were thinking, I might be the person that finds the first piece of debris of MH370. And they also had, organized beach cleanup days because they're good citizens and they want a clean beach. And so I talked to them and they said, yeah, we're definitely looking for it.
So Ebensmeyer, he brought up an interesting statistic. He said that if we assume that the impact generated 1 million fragments, and if 0.1% of the fragments reached the coast, that's 1,000 objects, or 1 per mile of Australian coastline.
But yeah, and again, to like look at previous analogies too, when Air France 447 went down, hundreds of pieces and bodies were found floating. And so, yeah, there should be a significant discovery. So you've got a lot of pieces potentially reaching shore, and you've got a lot of people looking for them.
The Tanagora Blue Foundation is the group in the Western Australia Beach Cleanup Day, and they do that October 11th and 12th. And 1,500 volunteers combed 130 beaches up and down the western coast, collecting plastic, other debris, no flotsam, maybe some jetsam.
Neither flotsam nor jetsam.
But yeah, they were very, very well aware that they could be the ones who found it. And apparently, you also talked to that person. You talked to Renee Moritz. You talked to a lot of people, Jeff.
Well, Andy, if I may, I mean,
Please.
This is my approach. It's like, because, there's been some frustration because there's certain investigators might be too generous of a term. Like there's people who have theories about this and they'll cook up a theory and they'll never check it out. And so I'm like, if you have a question and you're a journalist, then find somebody who will have an answer to that question. So that's why I talked to the drift modeler and why I talked to the lady running the search on the beach. And I've talked to a lot of other people since. They expected to find debris on the Australian coast. There was good reason to think that they would find debris. They certainly had enough people to find it, and they didn't find it. And in the years that have followed, it's now been a decade, and they have never, not a single piece of MH370 has ever been found on the Australian coast.
They even had like a protocol on how to report it back to their group.
So they had these 1,500 people who were, basically looking for garbage. I mean, picking up garbage, trying to make it a nice beach because Australians love a beach and they want to have a nice beach. But as a sort of secondary goal was, as you're picking up all this junk, if you come across something that looks like a piece of an airplane or a seat cushion or what have you, this is what you should do. So there was a whole protocol. It wasn't just like these things probably got lost because people didn't know what to do. Everyone was aware. Everyone had been given instructions. They were all like standing by.
By mid 2015, the search had reached this like limbo stage. The seabed search didn't find anything. The extensive search of Australian beaches didn't find anything. And the only reason to think that the plane had gone south was this set of Inmarsat data that had been generated as a result of an equipment reboot that nobody could explain.
And I had already figured out and published and talked about on international TV the fact that there seemed to be a vulnerability in the airplane that would have allowed someone to fake this signal if they were highly motivated and highly sophisticated. So all of these things taken together, and by this point, by the way, the seabed search in which so many hopes had been pinned, they'd already, the original search area that they said they were 97% certain it was going to be in that area had already been found empty. And so they had just gone ahead and doubled it without any real analytical reason for doing so.
And then on July 29th, 2015, this happened.
A 2-meter-long piece of wreckage found on a beach in Reunion Island. According to the Malaysian Prime Minister, it probably belongs to a Boeing 777. But for now, Malaysian, Australian and French authorities have not confirmed whether it's a piece of wing from flight MH370, although this latest discovery seems to be a good lead.
It is a realistic possibility that wreckage from MH370, if it entered the Indian Ocean in the place where our current search operations are being undertaken, could have reached the Reunion Islands in the 16 months since the incident.
According to a local newspaper, parts of a suitcase were also found near the piece of wreckage. A serial number can be read on the flaperon, and it's expected to confirm whether it belongs to Flight 370 that went missing in March last year, with 239 people on board.
Obviously, this came as a huge shock, and it changed everything about the search for MH370.